Today we're going to be looking at which angry walking coffin is best at punching you to death with his power fist. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we're going to be doing another Math Hammer style video, comparing the numbers on the various close combat orientated dreadnoughts that are available to Space Marines, seeing which ones have the highest damage output and durability, and then talking about a few other real world factors in game. Now, as a general principle, the close combat orientated dreads, particularly the dedicated ones without any guns, don't tend to be quite as strong in the competitive game as their ranged counterparts, so this video is going to be somewhat theory hammer, assuming that you do manage to make a charge with these dreadnoughts. That being said, let's take a look at the numbers. So this table shows the average amount of damage output against elite infantry, vehicles and tough vehicles with toughness 8. I've tried to include every variant of dreadnought that can be given a dreadnought close combat weapon. I'm afraid I have left out unique named character dreadnoughts, and the unique close combat dreadnoughts available to Space Wolves and Blood Angels. Today we're going to focus on the dreadnoughts that are available to all chapters, and maybe in the future we'll go back to add them in as well. We have already done a few videos on the Blood Angels unique dreadnoughts, and I'm certainly looking forward to covering the Space Wolves ones once the Saga of the Beast is released, which it isn't at this point. All that being said, let's talk about these numbers. I chose to look at the damage output per 100 points, as it's a more efficient way of weighting these dreadnoughts, as you can see they have all different points costs. The dreadnoughts I've selected are as optimised for close combat as I could make them in each case, basically spending the very least amount on guns that I could as they're not taking part in this equation, and for this comparison I'm assuming that they have shock assault but aren't in the assault doctrine yet, so we're fighting in turn 1 or turn 2. So let's talk through the different dreadnoughts that we have fighting here. First of all, we have a Dreadnought and Venerable Dreadnought, where point for point the Venerable Dreadnought does more damage against all targets, as its slightly higher weapon skill outweighs the number of increased points that you spend on it, so it's a little bit more dangerous point for point than the standard Naught. Next we move on to the Ironclad. I've chosen to equip him with a Chain Fist, as it's basically mathematically superior to the seismic hammer in almost every circumstance. This has about the same damage output against the Primaris Space Marines, but when you turn it on armoured targets, the Ironclad is actually significantly ahead because of this Chain Fist, and if you can get an Ironclad into close combat with a heavy target, then it's actually one of the most efficient dreadnoughts on the list. Next, if we look at the Invictor and Redemptor, in terms of raw numbers in melee, they just don't really stack up against the standard dreadnoughts. In general, they're just as fighty, and the Redemptor is actually slightly more fighty than your standard dreadnought. But realistically these two are unlikely to ever be the most efficient sources of melee combat just because they're paying for all of the guns that come on them. These guys pack some of the heaviest firepower on this entire list, so while they're both very good all-round dreadnoughts, they aren't quite as efficient in terms of pure melee. This certainly isn't to say that they're bad. In particular, the Invictor has a massive advantage in that it can deploy up the board and potentially get a first turn charge, which none of the rest of these guys are ever going to be guaranteed. So despite fairly low overall numbers point for point, the Invictor might be one of the strongest melee dreads on this entire list still, purely because of that scout deployment. Next up we get to the Contemptor Dreadnoughts. We have the standard Contemptor from the Codex, who interestingly, because of his strength 14, when he has his Dreadnought close combat weapon, does a bit better than some of the standard Dreadnoughts against a toughness 7 vehicle, but still a little bit behind against Primaris Marines and Leman Rosses. When we get to the Relic Contemptor Dreadnoughts though, we're really starting to see some close combat work done. I've included the stats for the Relic Contemptor with dual fists and dual saws, and both of these loadouts are honestly pretty cheap for what you get out of them, at least in terms of melee damage output. Basically the dual saws are just flat better with AP -4 and flat damage 4 and hitting at strength 14, and when you have two of them they reroll hit rolls of 1 in close combat as well. In particular, the Saw Contemptor has the very best stats on the entire list when you're attacking either toughness 7 vehicles or Leman Rosses, and provided you're playing a core Space Marines chapter, you might even be able to get them to fight again in the fight phase with Honour the Chapter, so they have the potential for a ludicrous amount of damage output. Next we come on to the Leviathan, who I've chosen to give the 2 siege drills as they're only slightly more expensive than the standard siege claws, and again are pretty much flatly better, aside from a reroll to wound against infantry, which generally doesn't matter too much as you're wounding on 2s anyway. These siege drills are strength 16, AP -4, flat damage 4, so only very moderately better than the Relic Contemptor's dual saw loadout. The thing is that the Relic Leviathan costs almost twice the points as the Relic Contemptor, so realistically with the same number of attacks it's going to struggle to compete in a 1v1 basis. I think that this is one of the main reasons that we tend to see Leviathans loaded up with their ranged weapons more than their melee versions. Finally, we have the Chaplain Dreadnought, who in this loadout I've given 2 close combat weapons, though honestly his damage output doesn't drop off a whole load if you do swap one out for one of those trusty character protected las cannons. Now, point for point, the Chaplain Dreadnought isn't actually much different to the Dreadnought or Venerable Dreadnoughts in terms of his damage output, but he is going to be a lot easier to deliver safely into close combat because the enemy can't shoot him until he's the closest unit. One advantage that the Chaplain Dreadnought has though is that baked into his points cost he can take the Mantra of Strength, the go-to litany if we're really trying to optimise him for close combat. This will add +1 to his attacks, strength and damage, making him an absolute close combat monster on any turn that it goes off. The numbers on the very bottom line are the ones for a Mantra of Strength Dreadnought, and this is including the chance of failing the Mantra of Strength, which you will do 1/3 of the time unless you go throwing command points at it. So these are a little bit lower than his actual numbers would be if he had the Mantra of Strength. And indeed, if he does, then he becomes the best Dreadnought in this list in terms of taking out vehicles as well. And even without any extra buffs, and even without re-rolling the litany, he's still the go-to choice for taking out elite infantry. So overall, in terms of damage output, the winners for me are the Relic Contemptor with the Saws, the Chaplain Dreadnought with Mantra of Strength, and the Ironclad Dreadnought. But damage output is of course only half the story, so let's take a quick look at durability too. Now in this table we have a breakdown of the number of successful hits needed to kill 100 points of the Dreadnought in question. Again, I've chosen to weight it for points because that shows how much durability you're buying per point invested. And as with the ranged Dreadnoughts, we do seem to have a pretty clear winner in the Relic Contemptor Dreadnought, who is just insanely durable point for point. A 2+ armor save combined with a 5+ invul save and a 6+ feel no pain type save just means that this guy is just remarkably resilient both at range and in close combat. Of course the dual fist Contemptor is going to be slightly more resilient than the dual saw one just because he's a bit cheaper for the same defensive profile. Other than this, the vast majority of the Dreadnoughts are fairly similar, seeming fairly well balanced against the various different incident firepower. A couple of notable ones are the Ironclad, which is very durable against both Strength 4 and Strength 7 shots, because its Toughness 8 just makes it survive that bit better. But it does mean that it's worse point per point than any other Dreadnought when you target true anti-tank weapons at it, like las cannons, who don't care about the Toughness 8. Other than the Relic Contemptor, the ones that are best at tanking las cannons are the Contemptor and the Chaplain Dreadnought, due to having 5+ invul saves built in, and also interestingly the Invictor, because he's just cheap and has a lot of wounds, and las cannons don't care whether you're Toughness 6 or Toughness 7. Finally, and fairly unsurprisingly, the Leviathan Dreadnought is also very tanky versus both bolt guns and autocannon shots, due to having Toughness 8 and a 2+ save, meaning even when we factored in its massive points cost, it's still very survivable point for point against anything that isn't dedicated anti-tank such as las cannons. So overall, both damage and durability wise, we seem to have decent success for the Relic Contemptor, and arguably the Chaplain Dreadnought as well, due to his durability potentially being even higher as you can't target him unless he's the closest. So in terms of raw numbers, these two are probably your ones to go for if you just want a fighty Dreadnought. Interestingly enough, the damage output of both of these guys in close combat really doesn't drop out all that much if you do trade out one of their saws or close combat weapons for a ranged weapon. So it's certainly not the worst idea to be fielding them with a twin las cannon arm, or for the Relic Contemptor, you could just stick a Cyclone missile launcher on the top. Obviously this would reduce their efficiency in terms of close combat a little, because you're paying for more points that isn't to do with close combat, but you'd drastically increase their shooting at the same time. So typically I'd say these would be the more competitive ways to go if you did want a fighty Dreadnought in an actual list in 40k where you do care about shooting at least somewhat. Finally, let's talk briefly about some other considerations for the Dreadnoughts. As I said, I haven't factored in guns to the equation at all, so any of these Dreadnoughts that do happen to have guns already is a big bonus in their part. In particular, the Invictor and Redemptor have really quite a lot of firepower and do fairly well in the Shooty Dread comparison lists as well. So they're certainly not masters of either shooting or close combat, but perform pretty decently in both. Movement speed is another factor. In particular, the Invictor is the fastest, with a whopping 10-inch movement, then Contemptors, Leviathans and Redemptors are next, which beat out the Ironclads and the regular-sized Dreadnoughts, as it's going to make the difference of what turn they get into close combat, and potentially what the risk of them failing their charge is. If they don't make the charge, then obviously they're not going to be doing any more damage in close combat. It's another bonus for our Relic Contemptor, who has 8-inch movement, so isn't too bad in this regard. Again, similar to our ranged Dreadnought comparison, bigger Dreadnoughts are generally more efficient in terms of stratagems or any one-unit buffs that you can put on them, such as spells or Chaplain Listeners. In particular, Duty Eternal is really important for Dreadnoughts. Even in its slightly diminished form, it's still well worth a command point, as well as any other damaging stratagem that you can put on the Dreadnoughts, such as we said, fighting again in the fight phase with Honour the Chapter. Conversely, the smaller Dreadnoughts will get more out of Master Artisans or Salamanders type rerolls if you're running those sort of chapters, due to getting more of those type rerolls point for point. Also, Dreadnoughts under 10 wounds don't degrade, which is a big bonus for those Chaplain Dreadnoughts and regular sized Dreads, as they'll keep on fighting at full capacity until they're actually destroyed. They also have the option of being transported in things like Storm Ravens, if you would like to go down that route. I'm not entirely certain it's the most efficient way of getting them to the front line, just because Storm Ravens are so much more expensive and you could potentially buy multiple more Dreadnoughts for the cost of one, but it certainly is an option. Next, we've mentioned some of these already, but the individual Dreadnought datasheets have various advantages and disadvantages. We've already mentioned that the Chaplain Dread can have litanies. He could use litanies to buff other things as well as just himself, and he also has that all-important character protection, which makes him absolutely great in terms of getting to the front line behind other screening units, or could potentially make him an incredibly nasty countercharge unit that your opponent can't do anything about until they're up close. You could give him a Warlord trait as well, as he is a character. We'd already mentioned that the Invictor can deploy very close to the enemy, meaning that it's likely to be in close combat far before the other Dreadnoughts, which is a massive positive, as it'll have more turns to do damage to the opponent and force them onto the back foot, having to deal with him straight away. He does lack the Dreadnought keyword for things like Duty Eternal and Wisdom of the Ancients and things though, which is a bit of a drawback. There's also a few other things, such as the relics, requiring another elite or heavy support choice to unlock them in the first place, such as that Relic Contemptor. And some of them have various sized explosions, and some go off a bit easier than others. In particular, big explosive Dreadnoughts such as the Leviathan and Invictors could potentially do a lot of damage to the enemy army if you do make a lucky explodes roll when they go down in the midst of their lines. Finally, if these guys are still alive by the time you do get to the Assault Doctrine, the ones that are going to get the most out of it are going to be the ones with AP 3 weapons rather than AP-4, as going from AP-4 to AP-5 isn't going to be relevant against the vast majority of targets. So if you do get to the Assault Doctrine, it's just a slight buff for all of the ones with regular Dreadnought fists rather than things like chainswords and siege drills. So overall, my favourite fighty Dreadnoughts are the Chaplain Dreadnought and Relic Contemptor, and though not a Dreadnought, the Invictor as well, because of its scout movement and decent firepower, as well as getting stuck into close combat turn 1. As I said at the start, I am well aware that the shooting Dreadnought options tend to be the stronger out of ranged or close combat at the moment, but it's still fun to see who can do the best in glorious melee. Let me know your thoughts and opinions if you've been using any of these in-game recently, particularly if they've been able to achieve any surprising feats. I'll be interested to read the comments down below. If you've enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we have 40k content coming out every single day. And if you'd like to support the channel, I do have a Patreon page, the link is down in the description below. If you're enjoying my videos, any support is greatly appreciated, as they do take quite a long time to make, and the Patreon is how I can afford to focus so much time on making a lot of Warhammer 40k videos. In any case, thank you very much for listening. I'll hope to see you guys next time.